Reading a landing note. We are recording. If you don't want your name or face to be seen, please feel free to mute or go off camera. We do hope to be able to share this as a resource for other folks who were not able to be here today and more broadly. Um, I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement of just acknowledging that we are meeting on traditional and ceded territories of many Indigenous nations from across the continent. As we recognize Indigenous lands, treaties, and peoples, we hope that this is a space of reflection that contributes to exposing truth, seeking justice, and building reconciliation. We honor the millennial peoples and nations in the Americas and beyond in resistance and resilience to colonial violence and dispossession of territories. In solidarity, we offer this info session in hopes that together we might build together a more fair, equitable, just, and dignified world for future generations. So just maybe take a moment to remember and think about the lands upon which you are calling from and how we honor and those lands and the treaties as well for ourselves today and for our future. And I think that's why many of us are here is because we have loved ones who are in a situation of a lot of climate uncertainty. Certainly, this summer has been an indication of how extreme heat due to climate change is affecting folks from across this country and beyond. And today we hope that the session will provide some insights on some of the risks that extreme heat in schools, especially mean for kids and the folks who support our kids in schools, as well as some ways that we can prepare the best we can. We know that I'm calling from Nova Scotia. There's certainly lots of room to do better, I think, for our kids and the classrooms where they are spending the majority of their time learning and growing. And we want to make those um, spaces where they are healthy and also where they can really thrive. So today we're very pleased to have with us Erica from the Canadian Partnership. I'm going to read your bio here, Erica. The Canadian Partnership for Children and Healthy Environment, sorry. And I'm gonna pass it over to Erica so that she can talk a little bit about what they've been up to with their campaign. Erica is the national coordinator and executive director, sorry, and working together to advance children's health and well-being by addressing toxic chemicals, climate-related illness risks, and other environmental concerns in the places where children live, play, learn, and grow. Kipchi's work includes leadership of Healthy Environments for Learning Day, held, which is an annual national campaign to improve early learning in school environments. She has a passion for connecting people across sectors and perspectives. Much of Erica's work focuses on promoting collaborative approaches to knowledge mobilization and policy advocacy towards the vision of a healthy, equitable, and sustainable environment for all children. She has a master's degree in public health, a doctorate in health promotion, and is an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa. So welcome, Erica, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Jackie, and thank you, Jackie, and the whole For Our Kids team for including Kipchi in this really timely event. I know we've come off yet another summer plagued by extreme heat events, and many kids and educators are heading back into educational settings that are ill-equipped to cope with climate-related issues, including extreme heat. So this is very timely, and thank you For Our Kids for pulling together this information session. And I can say we're in for a treat because Dr. Glen Kenny is not only exceedingly knowledgeable, but also really great at sharing what he knows with others. So I'm really looking forward to today's events. I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes just orienting you to Kipchi and our work. So thanks, Wayan, if you could go to the next one. So As Jackie mentioned, the Canadian Partnership for Children's Health and Environment is a national collaboration of organizations that have been working together for about 25 years to improve children's environmental health in Canada. And what we aim to do is increase awareness and catalyze action to ensure that all kids can grow up and thrive in healthy environments. Next slide, please. So one of the core initiatives that Kipchi has been leading for almost a decade now is our Healthy Environments for Learning Day annual campaigns. So these are campaigns where we bring together multiple partners into a collaborative effort to focus on a specific theme of relevance to children's health and well-being in their learning settings. It includes schools as well as childcare. And last year, in 2025, extreme heat was the focus of our annual campaign, focusing both on the health and risks to health and learning of extreme heat, but also the really urgent importance of better equipping schools and childcare settings to cope with climate-related risks. So every year we do what we call a collective call for action. It's a policy-oriented, co-created document that outlines the evidence and calls for specific actions. It is transmitted to the Prime Minister and provincial and territorial leaders and ministers in relevant ministries. Key recommendations from the extreme heat call for action, which was co-endorsed by For Our Kids and many others, were first and foremost to adopt a maximum indoor temperature standard. We called for 26 degrees, which is what the evidence currently supports, but I know further research is needed to really understand what the best level is for kids. Other recommendations were to invest in building retrofits, equipping educational settings with the means to take measures to protect kids, passive and behavioral cooling measures, for example, to prioritize equity by investing in mitigation and response in under-resourced communities, and doing a much better job of collecting data so that we know where the issues are and can systematically make progress towards addressing them. So that call for action is available on the website if anyone wants to see it. The next slide, please. And then just finally, we earlier this year, fortunately or not so fortunately, during one of the many heat waves, launched 3 videos. They're specifically focused on the childcare sector, but are equally relevant for schools, especially elementary grades. So there are 3 videos that we did together with Dr. Kenny, as well as childcare practitioners, really trying to address the on-the-ground reality that educators and families and kids are facing in reality across Canada. So 2 were focused on indoor settings, 1 specifically on when and how fans are useful and not. And then the 3rd was focusing on how to be more heat resilient in the outdoor childcare settings. So encourage you to check those out. They're available in English and French on our website and also on YouTube. And then just on the last slide, just a few other resources that may be of interest. We have a very comprehensive childcare resource hub. There's one of the sections on sun safety and extreme heat, but the resource itself covers a lot of environmental health issues for kids, which I think many of you will find interesting. Things like safer toy choices, cleaning products, the chemicals in cleaning products, and fragranced chemicals, all of these sorts of things that can help make childcare settings healthier for children and staff. And then finally, we recently released some FAQs co-created with experts to help schools and childcare settings navigate indoor air qualities related to climate, so wildfire, smoke, extreme heat, etc. I've put there my email address. Please get in touch. And my colleague Kieran, who coordinates the health campaigns, is also online. So Kieran, I invite you to put your email in the chat so people can get connected if you'd like to become involved in any of the work that we do. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Erica. And we will follow up with folks with a list of resources. And so if you also, you can see in the chat, there are some resources there that Erica mentioned, and we will be sure to send those out as well. If other folks have resources they want to share, please also do that in the chat. And we will try and keep track of all of those and make sure that we get those out in terms of follow-up and information. I want to take a minute to just introduce our my friend and colleague, Wyan Sandler, who is one of the co-directors of For Kids. She is here in also Mi'kmaq territory in Nova Scotia. And Wyan, I just wanted to give you a moment to introduce a little bit about the work of For Kids. We'll talk a bit more about the Extreme Heat campaign that we have as well, really based on and stemming out of what we learned from Kipchi in their held Day of Action in 2025 and how really that springboarded us into a campaign to support families that were really worried about extreme heat in school. So we'll take a minute to talk about that, but Wyan, I wanted to give you a moment to also just explain for folks who are not aware of what For Kids is, a little bit about the organization and how they might get involved.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jackie, and thanks so much everyone for being here. For Our Kids is a parent and grandparent and caregiver-led network of people who feel compelled to take climate action really for our kids and the next generation. So For Our Kids was founded in 2019 during a wave of kind of climate activism that saw a lot of youth-led actions taking place, and parents said, you know, we really need to have our kids' backs in this, and we need to be showing up as well. And also felt like there was a real need for that kind of community for parents who are concerned about the climate crisis and the impacts on our children. And we're seeing how that was playing out at home and at schools and in our communities. And so we operate on a sort of distributed organizing model. So we have local teams that come together of friends and colleagues and people who are in the same community or city who come together to organize kind of what makes sense to them in terms of what they're seeing and how they want to respond. And so we have about a little over 7,000 kind of supporters and members across the country. We have 16 local teams that are active. Last year, we had, more than 70 local climate actions that were organized by our teams. And we also do some national campaigns around things like clean air and methane. Also, we're around school climate action, and we've been hearing and as Jackie mentioned, our participation and support of the Kipchi campaign on extreme heat in childcare and school settings last year was really a turning point, and we knew that this was an issue that our network and that you all wanted to be working on. So if you're interested, I'll drop my contact information in the chat. Jackie's dropped the link to our website. We're always interested in talking with you about what's important to you and how we can support parents to get more involved. And so please do get in touch if you're interested in learning more.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. And yeah, just knowing that there are parents organized. Um, for me as a parent, I know that that is gives me hope in times of like a lot of climate uncertainty and a lot of sometimes feeling alone and not sure where to turn. And I really, what I appreciate about For Kids is kind of the resources, both like material, but also just the human resources and the support that folks can get when things seem really big and overwhelming, and figuring out how to take local action for kids in meaningful ways in community has been really meaningful for me as a parent and also as someone who's part of the network. So thanks for explaining a bit more about that. And we will talk a little bit more about our extreme heat campaign, but I know that many of you came here to listen and hear from Dr. Kenny. So I want to make sure we have lots of time to hear from Dr. Kenny this morning or this afternoon, wherever you may be. I'm going to pass it over to him so he can introduce himself in the best way possible. And just before we begin, I just want to say many thanks on behalf of For Our Kids and Kipchi for taking the time, Dr. Kenny and your team and other folks who are here with us today, not only for being here, but really being at the forefront of understanding better what the risks are and what our response in terms of practical measures as families can take, but also much bigger than that as well, what the policy could, where it should be moving, and how we can really make schools and environments safer for kids and other vulnerable populations. So thank you for the work that you do, and thank you very much for being here today. And with that, I will pass it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. It's really exciting to be here, and certainly to be invited by For Our Kids, Jackie and Leanne, and certainly I want to thank you both for as well joining in partnering with us on our CRHR grant, which will be directed addressing some of the critical questions related to the impacts of extreme heat on children, and as well with Erica from Kipchi as well being part of our partnership here as well. So thank you very much. This is exciting. And other than my name, Glenn, and I want to say one thing. My office is a little cleaner than I saw in that picture that Erica showed. So I did clean up a bit. Thank you very much on that. Yeah, so let's get, I do have a presentation for you that I'm going to share. So give me 1 second. I'm just going to get it set up here. And so that way we can walk through. Hopefully you'll see that right now. I'm just going to put it on presentation mode so you'll get it. Nice view. Um, so essentially what I think we're talking about, the impacts of extreme heat. And I think right off the bat, if we all seen what's happening in Europe, we absolutely know that children are facing unparalleled levels of heat stress. We already know that they were exposed more than 3 times the level of extreme heat this year than they did last year. And the impacts were quite profound in Europe alone. And certainly in Canada, I hear all the time that people say, you don't have extreme heat. That's not the point. We're just not going to be as well adapted to that. And even small increases, short duration, can have a dramatic effect on how children and the general population can cope with heat. So one of the key things that we have to ask ourselves, and I was a bit surprised to see some of the different medical associations characterizing children and young adults as being equivalent. In other words, children are just small adults, and that would be false. And we just did a large, major systematic review meta-analysis that we submitted to the Lancet, and essentially it's in review right now, but it really questions the sort of the evidence that supports these kind of statements. And what I want to show you, without getting down deep into deep into the weeds, what we need to know is there are fundamental differences. Children are smaller in size. So obviously when we look at that surface area to body mass ratio, essentially they're going to gain a lot more heat when exposed to those warm conditions. And certainly they generate more heat when they're physically active, but they also have, more importantly, that reduced ability to sweat. So that means that number one, that's your major avenue. When you're sitting in a hot classroom, when you're outdoors being physically active, that's your main avenue for heat dissipation, but they just don't have that same capacity. And less skin blood flow. Essentially, there's second avenue, increased skin blood flow, get rid of that heat. They simply have that, don't have that same capacity. So, but that doesn't mean that children are vulnerable across all temperatures. And Erica noted that we have to define what that indoor temperature will be. What is that threshold where these differences do in fact matter? And that's the fundamental question we have to pose. Now, one of the things that we've been talking about, and I'm so glad to hear this, and this is really frustrating when I hear, even when people review grants and or think about, what children face, I hear that, from government sometimes it's not our responsibility, but children don't have access to cooling all the time. There are many schools that don't have access to air conditioning. I want you to think about that. Let's go back to the Western Heat Dome of 2021. 619 people died. Now, children were equally impacted. How were they impacted? They were impacted by the fact that they were living in overheated homes. They were going to facilities that essentially might have had indoor temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius. Now imagine that you are living in that condition, not for 1 day, not for two, but 6, 7, 8, 9 days. Imagine the toll that has on you when you're exposed to those conditions. Now, One other thing to consider as well is we are relied upon portable schools or portable classrooms these days because there's such a limited space, especially in those older areas where there's older schools. And I see it here in Ottawa where there's more portables than I've ever seen being built across schools. And the challenge with that is they're really just a hot box. In the absence of having adequate cooling, either you're going to overcool or you're going to essentially have a room or just a lack of appropriate cooling. And that temperature can increase. And I'm showing you this because essentially that's the real exposure that they're going to face. And imagine, I want you to imagine you're the parent and your child's going to write an exam or a test or, undergo some kind of evaluation. If it's in the morning, that level of stress is not as high. But imagine they've been struggling through that day, and by the end of the day, they're going to be less resilient. They're going to be under stress. So if their test and their assessment is later in the day, that could have huge impacts on them. So what happens that we need to think about when not just the indoor overheating when they're exposed to heat, how many children today have to walk to school? Many of them will generate a lot of heat before they even get to school. So that poses a risk to the child. As well, what you see them at the end of a long day of being exposed to indoor overheating, they have to come back and they have to walk home. So there are some that are generating heat. Now, I want you to think about that because that'll carry over. That adds to that burden. And always remember that when you're looking at that strain, that physiological strain, you have to think about its accumulated effect. Now, one thing that is possibly the most important thing, and again, coming back to physical activity, is that children are active. That's just a fact. Move around a lot, want to be active, want to be engaged, moving from classroom to classroom during breaks. They're going to be active and they're going to be engaged, but you have to remember that that's going to amplify the effect of that heat. You've got the environmental heat, indoor overheating. Let's just say that gym does not have cooling. They're generating heat. That heat is going to be conserved in the body. It's not going to be released as they're sitting in classroom. There's this false expectation that essentially that heat suddenly, as you stop exercising, is going to be removed. No, it takes time. Air is not a great conductor of heat relative to you being immersed in a cold water bath. So these children are going to expose this high level of strain that can lead to heat-related illness. And certainly we know as that temperature gets hotter, you're going to see that cognitive and performance effects. So very important, but how does this ultimately affect the child? And that's very important because like workers, what we see with workers is the same thing. They work all day long and then they come home, they're withdrawn. Children are the same. Essentially, you're going to see mood swings, irritability. They're going to be feeling down. They're going to be withdrawn, less engaged. What does that mean? So you as a parent or you as a teacher may not recognize those signs. You may think maybe it's, they're suffering from maybe, things aren't going well, maybe a mental health issue. But you have to remember heat can compromise a person's well-being, a person's mental health, and it can cause them, because they're struggling, that level of strain is so high that essentially they don't know how to cope with it. And what you may see as a child come home, your children are coming home, and essentially they're going to be withdrawn from the family. And you may think that something has happened during the day. It's simply the fact that they may be exposed to heat day long. And that can affect their engagement and their willingness to, participate in activities. Another thing to think about as well is it really ultimately is going to affect learning. And to me, that's ultimately very important. That engagement is critical in that learning process, right? Being part of that process and being captivated by the lessons that's being given by that teacher and be able to retain that. I have enough trouble retaining a lot of information. So when it's hot, it makes that matter worse, right? You're simply not going to be able to focus on what is that information that's being conveyed to you. So you're going to see that attention is going to drop. And essentially, they're just not going to be able to have that same level of working memory. It means that you're just not going to retain as much information. Now, the other thing to think about, we got to go back to that heat wave. It's not just in the school. If you have children that are essentially going home and don't have the resources or their parents don't have in their home air conditioning, that's going to further disrupt sleep. But even then, if they go home and they're heat stressed, it can cause sleep disruptions, and that can get worse over successive days. Now, one other factor that I think is compelling, and one of the things we have to think about is that children are reliant upon adults to recognize when they are heat stressed. So, when we think about it, you or I can go out and say, listen, we're exercising. Guess what? I'm heat stressed, I'm going to stop exercising, withdraw from that activity. Children, as our field study showed, when they're active outdoors, they stay active and they don't know when to stop because they're engaged in that. They don't listen to the cues the same way. And that will be one other one, and that is thirst. They just don't respond to that same thirst sensation. Now, the other group is older adults. So we see it across the spectrum. As we get older, we see that opposite happening. It's the same issue with elderly adults. So it's very important that you, as a leader, as a parent, recognize and become familiar with the signs, and recognize that essentially a child may not be able to recognize when to stop being active and when to actually remove themselves from that exposure. And again, recognize that dehydration can further affect mental performance. It can increase irritability, and what you're going to see is anger builds up. The biggest thing we see with workers, same thing, is you're going to get a worker become irritable, more belligerent. And that's because the stress and the strain of feeling dehydrated. And I heard the first time this term angry or hungry, I can't remember the term, Hangry, but essentially it's the same effects associated with dehydration. It worsens the effects of that high level of physiological strain. Now we're talking, Erica was talking about indoor temperatures, and yes, Health Canada came up with its guidance, and I do want to, take this opportunity to thank Health Canada, who has supported our work, just been great partners. The one thing that we think about, we developed the guidance based on data from, based on our work during COVID, in older adults, where we exposed them to day-long heat conditions. So one was at 22 air conditioned cooling, 26, 31, 36, and we found that at 26 it preserved that level of physiological strain. We have to recognize one thing: these are individuals that are staying rested. Children are a little more active. And as a result of that environment as well, they're sometimes a little more overdressed. They're not sitting there with, their tank tops and what have you, where there's increased surface area for heat exposure. So Erica was correct. We do need to define what that threshold is. Can we then, based off our data, and you'll see our data for older adults, will children respond similarly? So this is part of the work that we conducted pilot work early on, and I have two people on here, Prisha and Tasvia, are on this presentation, who are graduate students and working on this project as well. And one of the key things that we're trying to address is, number one, if we are having children in these hot school environments, are they going to function normally? But we want to eliminate or remove that physiological strain. Why? So they can focus on learning, so they can get the best out of that environment. Now, the other thing to think about is that, number one, in the absence of having air conditioning, we're really reliant upon other ways in which to cool. And that's pedestal fans that you see on the left over here, and cooling zones where there might be, cool space like you might see in a library or dining hall. Now, the one thing, and again, the reason I'm showing you this is because the messaging comes a lot from, our work on older adults, where number one, we showed that fans don't actually work. Fans make you feel better. If you sit in front of a fan, makes you feel better. But does it remove the heat? No. There is a certain temperature where it has no benefits. And what we want to understand, I've heard this before, from different organizations, government agencies, that sometimes that is where, or local governments, where they say, listen, in these schools, we've been using these fans, or we have these cooling zones. But cooling zones, again, only provide a brief reprieve. The same thing we've shown with cooling centers. If you go to a cooling center, yeah, your core temperature is going down. You're going to feel a bit better. You go back to the heat, you actually heat up much faster. So you're going to change your behavior. A child's going to feel better. Imagine that. They're sitting in a cool space during lunch hour. They go out, I feel good. What am I going to do? I'm going to be more physically active. I feel good. So they're going to generate more heat. So they're actually going to get hotter than their non-cool counterparts. So part of the work that we're trying to do right now is assess how effective these mitigation strategies are going to be. So a few things to remind you. When we think about fans, fans are not there to cool you. Fans are there to draw in cooler air so that you can lower that strain. Alternatives as well, as you're starting school right now, certainly cover those windows. Radiant heat sources, as you know, child sitting in a car, they're going to get overheated. You have other ways. Encourage hydration. Limit that activity during the peak hours of the day. Try to have them exercise in areas where there's, tree coverage, where they're not exposed directly to heat and so forth. Things that common sense, of course. The other thing that we're going to be doing as our work with for our kids and Erica is that essentially we also want to define safe activity limits. I'm a bit stunned that I see, medical agencies or associations suggesting that children are essentially, again, small adults. They have very different tolerances to exercise and they generate heat more quickly. So we need to know what are those safe limits so that when you are guiding your children to perform activities outdoor, or whether it be summer camps even, or playing outdoors for their intramurals, or if they're playing for sports events after school, you need to know what those limits are. And that's part of the work that we're doing right now. We've already started our exercise trials to understand what these limits may be. So a few things to think about as well when you are being physically active out there, just recognize it as well. It's so critical for you to take the steps. There's this misguided belief that it's fall and somehow that they're going to be safer. No, when you think about fall, there is going to be, again, these hot summer day or hot fall days that you're going to experience. The problem is you're slowly again losing that adaptation from the summer. So they are going to be more vulnerable. So recognize that they will need to take more frequent breaks. And there's no question that hydration is extremely important to maintain, the protection of the child. Hydration, again, is important because sweating is what keeps us cool. And as we sweat, we lose body water. And as a result of that, that dehydration makes that child feel worse, makes or affects their mood state and their well-being. So they may come home feeling, in a state of malaise, and essentially you're not sure what is going on. Did my child have a fight at school? Did something go wrong? When in fact, what it truly is that exposure to heat. But the one thing I want to say to you is you're the leaders. You need to recognize those signs and symptoms because children rely upon adults. It's well defined, well described in many papers. They need us to define what those limits are, to stop them when they're going to be exposed to those conditions. So on that note, I do want to thank for our kids for allowing me to present to you today. And we're working together and as well with uh, Erica and other organizations to really try to develop that guidance that's needed so that we can come up with the best practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glenn. And um, I want to take a minute to let a lot of that kind of sink in for folks. I think there's so many really key points that you pointed out around one big thing that stands out for me is just the role that parents and teachers have in kind of guiding young kids and younger students through extreme heat. And I think one of the big things, like when I first started learning about this, was that there is like the lack of guidance is one of the biggest issues that I think parents and teachers and other folks in the education system face because they're not really sure what to do. They don't know what to do. They don't necessarily know what the signs are that they should be looking out for. They don't know how to mitigate the risks. And I think that lack of guidance is certainly something that is like glaringly apparent when we talk about extreme heat, indoor heat, especially. You also, we were talking once and you talked about just the areas, right? So you might say, well, it's this temperature outside, so it feels safer, but the whole area could be heating up. And especially we're not getting too much into playgrounds and outdoor. I know Erica spoke a little bit about outdoor areas, but around schools, talking about mitigation of like green trees and playgrounds that are not absorbing and creating more heat is also really important. So I wanted to say, yeah, that the lack of guidance and the lack of knowing where to go as parents and teachers, I think is one of the biggest issues that we face. So I'm gonna there's a couple of questions here in the chat, so maybe I'll read those, and if other folks have any comments or questions or experiences also that you want to share, please, you could raise your hand or you can write them here into the chat. So I have one question here. Over the whole school year, what is the prevalence of heat days and how is trending in Southern Ontario by month? How many schools don't have AC? I'm not sure if we know those specific uh, in here, I'll say here in Nova Scotia, we haven't identified any schools with AC. So um, I don't know if Erica or Glenn want to respond to that question in any way.
I don't have specific numbers other than I do know that the vast majority, especially the older schools, do not have air conditioning. So maybe Erica, you might have more information on that. But that is just off of, looking at the existing data, and I think Statistics Canada had a website on this or information on this, but it's quite prevalent across Canada. So I think the broader challenge is this, folks, and it's not, again, I think, even though there's air conditioning, it's you have to remember that sometimes as well, it doesn't keep up with the needs. One thing that's very important is when, I guess the best example is if we're all sitting in a meeting, in one room, we know how hot it can get very quickly, even with air conditioning on. And it's control. Some of them are just control and they're set at one limit. The problem is we're all generating heat when we get into that room, and by the time, especially if the curtains are open, in no time at all, that room can get up to 28, 29 degrees Celsius, no problem at all. So
Mhm.
it's not as simple as always just because there's air conditioning in a school that somehow is going to circumvent or eliminate that threat.
Thank you. I saw Desiree has their hand raised. I don't know if you want to say your question or comment, Desiree.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Desiree, calling in from Montreal. Yeah, my question, I guess, is more generally when you were talking about the data that's specific to children. I guess the question, not only specifically just to the heat, but in generally, is how do we get our policymakers to kind of have this more child-focused lens? Because I think, as you kept saying multiple times, like people just keep thinking children are little adults and they're not applying that lens. And so we think of places like schools and such, but we're not really taking that slice. And I think it's relevant to more than just this question or this particular topic, but I'm just curious about how that kind of data can be framed and how we can encourage people to really take that maybe child focused lens. Thanks.
Erica, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, I think a short answer would be make sure that we fund Glenn's lab to do the work that he's applied to do, which will look specifically at that question of precisely how are children different in their heat response. I do think, Kipchi has over the years done a lot of work on toxic chemicals and children's exposures, preconception, prenatal, and onwards. And absolutely, children are not little adults. You have developing bodies and brains. They're exquisitely susceptible to harm to environmental agents, whether they're chemicals or extreme heat, in ways that are different for a grown adult. So you're right that message needs to punch through. I think that there's been progress when it comes to pollutants and chemicals, but maybe not so much in terms of settings. And I think maybe the other thing that I will add is we have a real silo problem in the realm of educational settings because the funding for retrofits, for change, for policies and so forth comes from departments of environment, ministries of education. But the knowledge about the vulnerability of developing kids is a health knowledge by and large. So I think one of the things that we really need to do a better job of is insist that our departments of health and education work collaboratively and understand that children's health and well-being is integral to their learning. These are not separate missions or mandates. Kids, as Glenn just said, you can't learn, you can't be a well-functioning student. We talk about the number of kids who have trouble with behavioral issues. This extreme heat is not helping that. And educators will say it's really hard to teach a class of kids when not everybody's able to be fully present and able to function well. So the ministries of education should have a real vested interest in making sure that those settings set up kids for success. And we just need to do a much better job of getting that message from the health knowledge into the sphere of education and policy making.
Yeah, just to add to that, that's excellent, Erica. And the one thing I think is it's evidence-based, right? There essentially, of all the studies that I've seen as part of our reviews, there's 60 studies that have assessed children, and And there was just one study that just came out and said there's no differences between young adults and children, but you've got to look at the study design. I think at the end of the day, this is what we're trying to do, right? You have studies that are essentially exposing children for 1 or 2 hours. Listen, if I expose somebody 1 or 2 hours, there's not going to be much of an effect. And what we're forgetting is heat waves are not 1 to 2 hours long. Children are not exposed just in school. The harm is built during the daytime because that's when you get the superheating, right? That's the hottest part of the day, and that's when they're exposed to it. But you have many children, unfortunately, that are walking home, and unfortunately as well being exposed into overheating at nighttime. So I think, without the evidence, we cannot develop guidance. And the problem is I hear this all the time. If heat is a problem, just take them out of the heat. So, it's like saying to those poor people during the Western heat dome that had indoor temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius, outdoor was 47. Okay, what's the worst case scenario? I mean, do I go out at 47? Do I go at 40? I mean, it's harmful either way. So we need to have that evidence and we need to do the work. It's difficult work, but we need to do it to protect our children. And unfortunately, right now, this generation of children are going to be exposed constantly to extreme heat events, and that's going to be our reality. It's going to get worse.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
maybe just
thank
to
you.
briefly
Sorry.
add, just to underscore what Glenn just alluded to, there's a real equity issue here too. If you think about those kids, the 24-hour clock, kids in an unair conditioned school, in a playground without trees and natural surfacing, they go home to an apartment that's not air conditioned. These kids are really going to struggle and worsen any gaps in educational attainment and all manner of health issues and outcomes, including mental health. So, and also thinking about what Glenn has been saying about the walk to and from school. And of course, we want kids to be active and off their phones and doing those active things. But if you're walking to and from school on a nice tree-lined street, it's very different than walking to and from school in an urban desert that is devoid of anything green. So those are some of the community-wide investments that really need to be prioritized to make sure that, and Jackie, you alluded to this, the space around the school grounds and the neighboring community are part of what determines those children's heat load throughout the day. Sorry,
Yeah.
Jackie, I jumped in.
No, thank you very much, Erica, for adding that. And I know we've been talking walking to school and back, and also the kids who are on school buses, folks who are living in rural areas where they're on the bus from maybe 2:30 to 3:45 and there's no air conditioning. I live in a rural area. The kids aren't allowed to put the windows down because the dust coming in. So you're looking at buses that might be 45 degrees for 45 minutes on their way home. So I think that extreme heat also really just shows us how we're vulnerable in so many ways and how this issue is interconnected to so many issues around equity. It's around clean air. It's around ventilation in schools. So, and these are all touching on our exacerbating climate crisis and how they're compounding, right? And so I think addressing the issue of extreme heat in schools is multi-pronged. There's lots of ways that we need to go about addressing the issues and trying to just think about how to keep our kids safe, but working towards something bigger. I know at For Kids, we've talked about also schools as climate resiliency zones, especially in public in rural areas, for example, where there is little public infrastructure. So making sure that schools have conditions where maybe the broader public can come if there is a longer period of heat. Where elderly or more vulnerable folks who don't have access to conditions, if our schools were properly equipped, that might be a possible way of like responding to climate emergencies when they happen. And we've also talked a lot about the need to just plan. We know that this is happening. We know it's going to continue to happen. So how do we actually make an emergency climate plan for our schools? How do we create climate action plans for our schools so that we're looking at the issues, not as extreme heat only, but as how are these issues all interconnected? And I think, Erica, what you mentioned about working in silos is spot on. Definitely, that's been our experience here of like, that's not our issue, that's that department's issue. And it's like, well, these are actually interrelated and they're having an effect on everybody. So I think that's a really important point that you raised. There is a question that I think is a good one here. There's lots of great comments, and I want to get back to also the role of presenting this data and how can we take this information forward? How do we bring this to school boards? How do we bring this to decision makers? And how do we really try and inform policy so that it can reflect what the needs are today and moving forward? But there's a question from Melissa who said, are there any lessons we can learn from our international colleagues? So I wondered if either of you have any experiences or learnings or insights that you've maybe had from colleagues working on this issue internationally that might be helpful for the context we're living in now or going forward.
I'll just talking more from the research side of things. Essentially, yeah, there are other colleagues around the world that are addressing that problem, but from a more general perspective, in terms again, looking at the problem from in the way in which we need to understand it, that is children in school settings, right? It's again, much of what has been done in addressing the problem is just taking children and assessing them for brief periods of time and making assumptions based off of that. And that's why we get to these misguided conclusions about the similarities between young children and young adults. And so, from my perspective, looking at what's been done in Europe, and I know there's a crisis this summer with respect to children suffering from the exposure to extreme heat and having to have many of their activities canceled because of the fact that extreme heat was a problem. That again in itself is affecting their level of experience that they're going to get over the summer period. But beyond that, maybe Erica, you have something more to add to that.
Yeah, I wish I did, and I think it's a really excellent question. And I would imagine that countries around the world are grappling with these same sort of questions that we're trying to sort out here in Canada of how can we do better. And I think that there's a certain complacency where I can imagine decision makers saying, well, it was hot when I was a kid and I'm fine, that sort of attitude. But it's a different world. We are, as Glenn said, it's the number and the frequency and the intensity of these extreme heat events is like nothing we've ever seen before. And it's going to be on top of things like wildfire events and smoke events and all the other really important issues that for our kids and others are working on. So I wholeheartedly support the idea that this needs to be looked at in terms of the holistic and co-benefits that can be achieved of setting up our schools so that they can weather the impact of an extreme heat event and support the kids' health and well-being, which is the same intervention that you need to make sure you've got the ventilation in place to be able to filter out wildfire smoke and all the rest of it. So somehow we need to impress upon our policymakers that there's a package here that really needs to be done, and it's going to have benefits in it for multiple portfolios for those who are responsible for education, for health, environment, climate change, you name it. There's and future productivity. I mean, if we're not supporting our kids to learn, how do we build Canada strong?
Yeah, and just to add one more thing to that, listen, when we think about, heat related exposures, we're always relating the impact in terms of deaths associated with exposures. And because children, there's not as many deaths, there's this misguided belief that somehow they're more resilient. And what we're forgetting is that harm can occur simply by prolonged exposure, and we're just not measuring the impact. And that's the same thing, with workers. I've heard this enough by working with different companies across the U.S. That essentially they'll say to me, listen, out in the West Coast, they've had extreme heat, and they say, well, nobody's died, so there's not a problem. What they don't see is the impact on productivity. What they don't see is the impact on the families when the worker comes home and how it impacts the ability of that person to maintain their health overall and their mental well-being. So I think it's the narrative has always been that we have to focus on the most vulnerable. They are the most vulnerable. They're amongst the most vulnerable. And unless we, recognize that it does not need to be related to a higher rate of death, but the fact that their learning is impacted, and that ultimately will impact the future, our future, the well-being of our nation as a whole.
Thank you very much, Erica and Glenn. I wanted to just get to some of the kind of moving forward pieces. There's some comments here in the chat that I think are helpful, um, and concerns. There's a comment here saying from Devona saying, as a parent and as someone who works in the school system, I'm very concerned about one of our schools that turns into a hot box if there are several days of hot temperatures in a row over 30 degrees inside the school, so there is no reprieve. This is a grade 5 to 9 school. Upgrades rely on government funding, so we need to make a good case to government, but also we may be able to make changes as a school division, resources for exploring the best approach, maybe not just more portable fans. So really, and then there was another comment down below, I think just, yeah, the importance of parents and organizing in school boards or school committees that exist. And definitely that's just to bring us to some of the work that we're trying to do is for our kids as well, of providing resources so that you can do that advocacy at a local level with other concerned parents in your school and in your area. I'm going to share just really briefly here something.
Hmm.
Um, Let me see here. Document. Um, no, it's not coming up. I'm
Jackie,
sorry
while
about
you're
that.
looking for that, maybe I just can jump in
Yeah.
with one. We talked about fans. There are some other sort of low-hanging fruit in terms of mitigation, like blocking windows on the south or east facing side at the appropriate time of day, all of those sorts of things. And some of that is addressed in those videos that we shared. If anyone wants a quick primer, they're just a few minutes to walk through. And even if you don't have the right window coverings, there are ways to do a makeshift approach to block out some of that incoming solar radiation. So those are among the strategies that I think some folks aren't as familiar with as they are with the questionable value of just adding a whole bunch more fans.
Yeah,
Can I just
definitely.
jump
Yes.
in to expand on this? This particular school, there is window blockage. What's interesting is it's something about the way the school has been designed or built. It's actually the internal classrooms that are problematic. So there are literally classrooms that have no window exposure whatsoever, but the heat sort of pools there from throughout the building. And so I mean, when I say over 30, I mean 35, 36, 37. If the temperatures get to 28 plus outside, it is guaranteed to be at least 32 and above in those internal classrooms at all times. And so while they are doing some blocking of windows on the exterior of the building, it's that core temperature is not coming down.
How do we begin to help clients navigate their own anticipatory grief? There are some frameworks that have been around in the grief world for a while, and I just wanted to share.
All right. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what happened there. If Did you want to continue speaking? Sorry, I think you got cut off.
Yeah, that's okay. It's just a unique environment, and it's maybe not something that you can directly speak to, but
But
just
that's
trying
a,
to
sorry.
come up with a couple of angles to be able to take back to my school board and to my government to make some positive movement forward.
And just to that point, I want to give you a good example. The building that we're in was built in the 60s. There's no air conditioning in this building. So by design, the way they built it was assumed to be that in the summertime it would allow for enough cooling. And of course, temperatures have changed since, in the 1960s. So when you look at the designs of some of the buildings, the critical problem is air circulation. That same thing in long-term care during COVID. I heard enough that, there's air conditioning, there was some level of air cooling. The problem was that circulation is not enough. And you saw that in some of the rooms in long-term care during COVID reached 33, 35 degrees Celsius because many of them had these big, westerly facing windows. And the occupant, could not themselves necessarily shut the, blinds or the big drapes. But part of that is really, this is where fans are not necessarily there to improve comfort. They're there to move that air around, to have some level of air exchange. You need mass airflow to be able to remove that heat. We're all generating so much heat. So that's why I feel bad for some students, depending on their class location. Temperatures can be wildly different from one section of a building to another. So very critical point. And I think, having that ability to monitor and say, listen, here it is, here's the fact. We already know that in older persons, that these temperatures can cause harm, even, at 31 degrees Celsius, if it's sustained over long periods of time. So just that alone, if you were able to document and record that, that would be very important to demonstrate that there could be impact.
Mhm. Great. Thank you very much. And I'm sharing here my screen, which just has a few of the resources that we have available for parents and families. So we have folks have talked about different ways that they might take action. We know that like writing letters, even getting a group, if you could get together a couple of people, like 4 or 5 people, to each write a letter and write where your concerns are and send that. We know that that does have an impact. It's flagging it as an issue for decision makers and our government. So, and also the school boards and the people that make decisions. Definitely every jurisdiction across the country has a different way of decision making, but kind of trying to make sure that they all know that this is an issue that you're concerned about is important. So we do have letter templates. We have online survey templates, which you can take and we can share here, but also that you could take to your school and get parents to fill out. So all this data is helpful because it helps us know what the reality is, right? And we also have things like an email template. We have a template for an op-ed if that's something that you feel like you could do and place in a local news outlet. We have a few images and other resources as well from Dr. Kenny and from Kipchi that we will share and that are actually on our website. If you go to our website, we have those. We have a campaign backgrounder and other resources. But we really do believe that taking a step, letting decision makers know that this is something that you're concerned about, that more research needs to happen, but also that your school can take action around creating a plan, knowing what to do. Most schools that I've been in touch with here don't know what to do. So administrators, we've heard of some schools where some of you have said like this, the windows don't even open, much less is there air conditioning or a proper ventilation system. So administrators are scrambling to know what to do. They don't know if they should. There's no protocol around, do we close a school? But also, as Dr. Kenny and Eric mentioned, equity is an issue. So simply canceling school doesn't mean that you're going to have better conditions at home for kids. So this really is an issue that needs to be addressed. We believe, and we want to give you tools and resources to be able to make this something that officials know that you care about. So please do reach out to us. Like I said, we will follow up with folks. And if there's something specific or you're wondering if anybody else might already have contacted us in your area and you want to connect with them, you could also reach out to us to see if we might connect you with local groups that are maybe already working on this issue. So we've kind of come to our end of our time, but I did want to give a final word to Dr. Kenny and to Erica and YN if you're there, if you have any last thing that you want to say. We have lots of comments too, so we will try and make sure we can answer these to the best of our ability and also share the resources that we have received. In Ontario, I do want to say that there was a bill tabled, Bill 123 on extreme heat, that was tabled in June, I believe, or May in the spring sometime. So we'll send out some information about that and how folks might also support that initiative in Ontario to really kind of address the issue of extreme heat in schools. So thank you very much all for your time, for your interest, for all the work that you're doing for your kids and for your communities, and with so much love and care. And we really, really appreciate you. Glenn or Erica, weigh in if you have any final words. We'd love to close with that.
Go ahead, Erica.
Well, I'd just like to jump in to just say how essential and vital and impactful it is to have parents and grandparents and caregivers and people in communities picking up these issues and doing that local advocacy. There's really nothing that's more important than that. And those of us who try to synthesize the research and put some ideas forward about policy change. We're very grateful for that on the ground work that you do and hope that we can have a synergistic relationship. So please always get in touch, reach out if you want to be part of our campaigns.
Yeah, I echo that. And I think our voices matter here. And like I said, I think we have to be more outspoken, right? And I think getting that message out there so that that we can have an impact. And I think as well for those my young graduate trainees that are on this call as well, that they can see the impact of the work that they're doing. It's important. These are difficult trials that we do, but they're important. And they're going to affect people's lives. And I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is essentially work together for our kids, Kipchi, and really try to have an impact. So everybody that's participating in today, thank you very much, and certainly reach out if you have questions anytime.
Yeah. And I'll just echo that. It's been wonderful to have this collaboration and looking forward to ongoing collaboration. And anyone who's on the call and wanting to follow up or wanting some resources or support, please do reach out. I've dropped my contact information and Jackie's contact information in the chat, and we're here to support you in taking the next steps. Oh,
You're on mute.
I'm on mute. Thank you. I didn't do that the whole call, so it wouldn't have been a proper Zoom meeting without at least that happening once. Thanks to each and every one of you for being here today. We will follow up. We do hope we can convene again also to hear more about what happened. What did this fall look like for you? What are you taking forward? Any feedback you get also from elected officials or other folks you communicate with us on this issue. We'd love to hear what's happening in your realm and in your community. So thank you, and we'll be in touch. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye for now. Thanks, everyone.